Let's think about the Teachers College in our hearts and minds, which touches every corner of the world every day. What is Teachers College? It's the epicenter of education, health, and psychology. It is nearly every school system, community health program, and multicultural counseling program in the United States and beyond. But it's also a coffee cart on West 120th Street. It's a speeding number 1 train. It's the early morning sunlight over Morningside Park. And at this uncertain moment, it's a way of being in a complicated world. Teachers College is the stuff that dreams are made of. It is a canvas on which each successive generation paints its murals. It's a universal library where we add our collective masterworks. It's a mixing board to lay down our tracks alongside the greats. Teachers College is Harlem, where we work with educators learning the neighborhood's proud history and legacy of resourcefulness and indomitable will. TC is America's community colleges, which are a gateway for underserved populations. And TC is also indelibly New York City, where we are helping schools transition to online education, bringing critically needed medical equipment to major hospitals, and providing psychological services, even as the current crisis touches us personally. But Teachers College is also Bangladesh and Lebanon. TC is Ecuador and Peru. It's Ghana and Cambodia and Bolivia. It's China and it's Europe. On almost every continent, we find TC, creating and improving schools, bringing visits to young people worldwide through hip-hop pedagogy, giving displaced people new hope, working with indigenous populations to preserve their own languages, helping children with cleft palate reclaim their lives, empowering children with autism to utter their first words. All of these people, states, and countries are Teachers College, as are all the places our students call home. It's everywhere that our graduates are shaping a healthier, better educated, more equitable, and more joyful world. TC is in our hearts and minds, as well as in every corner of the world.
It is now my great pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker, introducing this theme, Dr. John Perpener, and his talk entitled African American Dancers and the Harlem Renaissance. Dr. Perpener is a dance historian and independent scholar who currently lives in Charlotte, North Carolina. He received his Ph.D. in Performance Studies from New York University and his MFA in Dance from Southern Methodist University. Dr. Perpener has held teaching positions at Florida State University, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, the University of Maryland College Park, as well as Howard University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Perpener has lectured nationally and internationally and has served as a primary consultant for the PBS documentary film Free to Dance. His most recent essays have been published online as part of the Jacob Pillow Dance Festival's archival project, Dance Interactive. His book, African American Concert Dance, The Harlem Renaissance and Beyond, is available for purchase in the virtual Arnhold Institute Symposium bookstore, navigable from the symposium website. Welcome, Dr. Perpener.
First of all, I want to thank everyone who has been involved in making this presentation possible. When I reflect on African American dance during the Harlem Renaissance, I am reminded of how it was surrounded by an amazing array of factors that shaped it, gave it life, and defined it as an artistic and cultural marker of its time. And that's why, before I go on to the central focus of this discussion, dance, I want to take a look at some of the factors that shaped how African Americans danced on the concert stage, in the vaudeville houses, and in the ballrooms and nightclubs of early 20th century America. In his seminal work, When Harlem Was in Vogue, author David Levering Lewis speaks of the many contexts that surrounded the period of America's cultural history that eventually became known as the Harlem Renaissance. In Lewis's work, one can see how the political, social, economic, and aesthetic realms of early 20th century America overlay each other like concentric circles, each one influencing the other. There was the post-World War I euphoria of victorious new beginnings, mixed with the realities that African-American soldiers faced returning to their communities, where in 1918 and 1919, rampant racism was resulting in a wave of lynching and looting aimed at the destruction of Black communities. There were new organizations such as the NAACP that created legal strategies to dismantle infrastructures that had been created to, quote unquote, keep Black people in their place. That place for many African Americans was in destitute communities in the South, where they lived as sharecroppers under a system of peonage that was just barely an improvement over slavery. But the desire to escape violence, seek economic opportunities, and generally better their lives led many of the Black underclass to leave the South for urban centers in the North, Midwest, and West during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Lewis also stresses the importance of another class of African Americans who were more fortunate and belonged to a group that was well educated and much better off. Those individuals had some access, though limited, to the halls where Americans' political, social, and economic power was brokered. The preeminent representative of that group was William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, often described as patrician, well-bred, noble, aristocratic, educated, and refined. Du Bois had all of the pedigrees to qualify for that label. He was educated at Fisk University, Harvard, and the University of Berlin. His many professions included journalist, sociologist, civil rights activist, and novelist. And he was one of the founders of the Niagara movement, which developed into the NAACP. One of Du Bois's ideas that is often cited as indicating the identity markers that existed between different groups of African Americans was his concept positing how a remarkable group of Black folks would lead a movement to improve the lot of everyone in their race. That formulation asserted that this elite group, what he called the talented 10th, could accomplish this because of their education and intellectual acumen, and no doubt because of their patrician bearing. As upper-class symbols of racial accomplishments, the talented 10th would herald the positive promise of the entire race and pave the way for acceptance by mainstream America. Corrective sociology seems to have been the name of the game for many of the Black intellectuals and activists of the early 20th century. Another one of the leading proponents of this approach was Charles Spurgeon Johnson. His strategy for racial betterment takes us even deeper into the foundational ideas that underlay this period of momentous artistic achievement in Black America. Johnson pursued graduate studies at the University of Chicago, and it was there that he was introduced to the idea of sociological positivism, a theory forwarded by one of his professors, Robert E. Park. According to Park, Blacks in America would move through ever-ascending levels of progress that, in spite of various setbacks, would lead them irreversibly towards an equal status in American society. In addition to this, Park believed that each racial group had a distinctive essence. For example, Jews were intellectual, and Anglo-Saxons were pioneering and adventuresome. The quote-unquote Negro's essence was their artistic temperament, and if they developed this gift to the fullest, they would be able to interact with other Americans to encourage social acceptance for the entire race. As with the talented 10th, this would be a special group of Black people who would lead the way. This idea has fascinated me since I first encountered it in Lewis's book. Like other ideas of the time concerning racial uplift, it was aspirational, and it indicated how thinkers like Du Bois and Johnson struggled with solving the realities of racial oppression in America. It also occurred to me that, as hopeful as it was, sociological positivism was an idea that would strike us today as being hopelessly mired in a kind of self-abnegating essentialism. But these were the constructs that helped motivate Black people during that particular period of racial oppression. Another fascinating contextual aspect of the Harlem Renaissance was the significant role that European Americans played in forwarding these ideas. In literary and theatrical arenas, white authors and playwrights of the 1920s drew on material from Black life to create narratives and characters that fit their own versions of racial representation. These characters might depict noble savages, unfettered from the dehumanization of modern society and still in touch with the purity of human nature. There were also more exotic characters whose sensuality was another way of affirming their earthy humanity. These white artists' approach was a kind of adulatory elevation of Black people as saviors of a degenerate Western world, and it added to the growing interest in Black Americans by those who had the power to underwrite and promote artistic projects: philanthropists, publishers and editors, critics, and other cultural arbiters. Black intellectuals like Du Bois, Johnson, and their fellow strategists joined forces with these white power brokers and began building an infrastructure consisting of literary prizes, funding opportunities, publications, scholarships, and art gallery openings that would support an artistic movement. And all of this, as Lewis points out, centered on the vibrant, multifaceted, and aspirational community of Harlem. By 1925, the Harlem Renaissance was underway. It was very much a literary movement with stars like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. There were also theatrical achievements with prominent figures such as Paul Robeson, and groundbreaking musicals like Shuffle Along. It was a time when musical geniuses like William Grant Still and Duke Ellington were planting the seeds of their significant careers. And it saw the rise of an international entertainment phenomenon, Josephine Baker, who was the Madonna and the Jennifer Lopez of her time. I think of dance during this period as a cultural and artistic element that lived in many different forms. In my own book, African American Concert Dance, the Harlem Renaissance and Beyond, I speak of dance in general as serving a symbolic function for Black poets and painters of the Harlem Renaissance. The image of the dancer basking in sensuality and free from the shackles of modern society could be found in the poetry of Langston Hughes and the sculptures of Richmond Barthé. In its embodied form, dance was a social mainstay in America, with dance crazes like the Black Bottom, the Charleston, and the Lindy Hop sweeping the country one after another. Black Harlemites socialized and danced at nightclubs, ballrooms, and house parties, re-energizing the dances that many of them had brought when they migrated from the South. Moreover, these were dances that had even deeper roots in the African cultures of their ancestors. African American musical theater was another generator of dance movement innovation, with Black performers making inroads on Broadway stages and at theaters like the Lafayette in Harlem. In these different settings, I think of dance as being an embodied expression of the vital spirit that Black people cultivated as they sought to end racial oppression and move physically and ideologically toward equality in the American project. In this conceptualization, we can see another aspect of sociological positivism. This brings me to another manifestation of dance during the Harlem Renaissance, one where African American artists aspired to achieve recognition in the newly developing field of concert dance. In a sense, this was another interracial project, since the Black artists were seeking to join a movement initiated by white artists like Martha Graham and Doris Humphrey to create a kind of dance performance that could be accepted as high art, as opposed to popular entertainment or a social pastime. As Catherine Dunham later put it, quote, "Our goal is to attain a status in the dance world that will give the Negro dance student the courage really to study and a reason to do so, and to take our dance out of the burlesque to make it a more dignified art," unquote. Of course, the concept of high art is a questionable categorical distinction that seeks to establish a hierarchy of artistic expressions with specific forms of Western art placed at the top. In dance, classical ballet with its noble European pedigree was the preeminent art form that qualified for this distinction. However, in their search for aesthetic legitimacy, Black and white dance artists of the 1920s and 1930s eschewed the highly codified traditions of classical ballet and sought to establish an art form that was based on the individual artist's unique expressive voice. The new dancer would be attuned to the truth of her or his own experiences and responsive to the social and political realities of their times. Like other artists of the Harlem Renaissance, aspiring African-American concert dancers would pursue this direction by exploring different aspects of African diaspora art and culture and adhering to the same ideology of racial uplift that Du Bois and Johnson preached. One of the earliest young artists who followed this path was Hemsley Winfield. As a teenager in Yonkers, New York, Winfield began to explore his interest in the arts by establishing his own theater group. At the time, American communities throughout the country were joining in the Little Theater movement, an initiative to establish community-based theater groups that were non-commercial, non-elitist, and staffed by semi-professionals and amateurs from the community. One such group in Harlem, the Krigua Players, was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois himself. Winfield established a theater group in Yonkers, but he soon moved on to study and perform with several groups in Harlem and Greenwich Village, New York, such as the National Ethiopian Art Theater and the Provincetown Playhouse. Around the same time, he began performing on Broadway in shows that white playwrights and producers created to capitalize on the rage for Blackness of the time. One such show, Harlem, was co-authored by a Black playwright and a white one. It was described as a black belt slice of life, and it had critics outdoing themselves in sensational commentaries that described the all-Black cast. One critic spoke of the sizzling dances in the play, and another described the performers as writhing lustily through their barbaric dances. These types of perceptions concerning African-American dance were exactly what Winfield and others would try to negate over the years by aspiring to create dance that would be considered serious art, another term used during the period. During the late 1920s, when Winfield was on the brink of organizing a dance company, he attempted to study with some of the white artists who had dance studios in New York. This would have been a hit and miss undertaking because most of those artists didn't accept Black dancers in their classes. And there were only an exceptional few who would offer private classes for African Americans. This was the state of affairs reflected in the early efforts of one of Winfield's contemporaries, Edna Guy. For some time, Guy had been studying with one of the pioneering European American concert dancers of the time, Ruth St. Denis, and she was just beginning to be recognized in New York's artistic circles. Edna Guy also joined Winfield in one of his first undertakings that was devoted entirely to dance. In April 1931, the two artists shared a concert titled "The First Negro Dance Concert in America." Most of the dances on the concert reflected the Harlem Renaissance imperative that was adopted by many Black artists of the time, to pursue a path that led toward African-American self-representation and the creation of work that explored a people's cultural history. In this vein, Winfield and his dancers performed Bronze Study and Jungle Wedding, and a work that was simply titled Negro. Among Guy's contributions to the program were two dances, Get on Board Little Children and Weeping Mary, that were performed to Negro spirituals. Guy was one of the first artists to choreograph dances to music that had its root in the culture of enslaved Americans. This practice of creating dances that were set to the distinctive rhythms and harmonics of African American music would become one of the characteristics of Black choreographers over the coming decades, as they embraced spirituals, the blues, jazz, gospel music, and other forms. The first Negro dance concert in America was groundbreaking in that it was a step toward legitimizing African American dance artists in the elevated genre of theatrical dance that was evolving at the time. Winfield and Guy's achievements included the fact that their concert garnered a considerable amount of press coverage by dance critics whose opinions reflected their support of the young artists as well as their prejudices against them. For example, John Martin of the New York Times noted that Negro artists had not previously approached the field of concert dance, and he went on to acknowledge the dancers' commendable efforts and considerable poise. But he also expressed an idea that he would revisit during the coming decades when he reviewed Black artists, that some forms of dance were appropriate for them and others were not. Quote, "It is not in these dances which echo and imitate the manner of the dancers of another race that the Negro dancers are at their best, but in those in which their forthrightness and simplicity have full play. Miss Guy's group of spirituals and the primitive ritual dances by the group can be counted in this category," unquote. Along these same lines, in a later article, Martin spoke of European American dance techniques and styles as being the art of an quote unquote alien culture that Black artists should not attempt to perform. Critics and cultural arbiters would voice these types of racial prescriptions again and again over the years, but it most often resulted in the redoubled effort of artists to establish their own institutions where they could continue to become conversant with new dance trends and pursue their own artistic innovations at the same time. This was a syncretic approach to art making that provided another path forward for Black artists over the years. During the early 1930s, Winfield continued building his dance company, and in January 1933, he reached a high point in his career when he and his dancers performed at one of New York's most prestigious venues, the Metropolitan Opera House. The occasion was the premiere of The Emperor Jones. The production was an adaptation of Eugene O'Neill's play, which is another example of white playwrights making enthusiastic forays into the themes and subject matter of Black life. The central character was Brutus Jones, an African American who flees to the West Indian islands, where he cunningly plays on the superstitions of the natives, exploits them, and appoints himself emperor. This central character was played by a European American opera singer, Lawrence Tibbett. His casting followed the tradition of the time in which major productions cast white artists in dark makeup as Black characters. Hemsley Winfield and his dancer appeared in a scene where Brutus Jones is pursued by personifications of his inner demons before he commits suicide. Winfield danced a solo as the witch doctor who leads Jones' tormentors. This was again one of those situations where, from today's perspective, one might think of Winfield and his dancers as engaging in stereotypical portrayals of Black people whose primary purpose in life is to dance with unrestrained primitivism. However, the critics of the time were far more positive for the most part. The music critic of the New York Herald Tribune opined that Winfield's dancers were a relief from the uninspired dancing that audiences usually saw at the Met. And she closed by saying, Congratulations to whomever was inspired to seek out Mr. Winfield and make his achievement possible. I think of the positive responses to Winfield's performances at the Metropolitan Opera as a prime example of Du Bois and Johnson's idea that the most efficacious way for African Americans to improve their lot was to promote the achievements of those individuals who were uniquely prepared to represent the race positively and move it forward. One of Winfield's last performances took place at an event organized by the Workers' Dance League, a collective of leftist dance groups whose aim was to use their work in the service of social justice. Jewish artists like Edith Siegel were among the vanguard of these activists. Winfield was invited to participate in the forum titled, "What Shall the Negro Dance About?" After his group and Siegel's group performed, the floor was open for discussion of the theme. One unidentified participant spoke with revolutionary zeal, quote, "We have come to a new place in dance, a dance that has social significance. Since we recognize the Negro as an exploited race, our dance should express the strivings of the new Negro. It should express our struggle for social, economic, and political equality and our part in the struggle against war," unquote. Winfield, who spoke briefly, acknowledged the fundamental human feelings that could be expressed through dance, and he also acknowledged the significance of the African American heritage and African American folk traditions in dance. Up to this point in his career, Hemsley Winfield's work presaged the promise that he would continue to make significant contributions to the world of theater dance in ways that would benefit African American communities and the country as a whole. Unfortunately, he fell ill and succumbed to pneumonia at New York Hospital on January the 15th, 1934, at the young age of 27. It would be another inspired young dancer choreography who would continue to make African American concert dance a vital component of art and culture in America. Unlike Winfield, Katherine Dunham would make her significant contributions to society for more than 6 decades. And though her accomplishments as a dancer and choreography would be outstanding, she would also make her multifaceted mark as an anthropologist, author, civil rights activist, educator, and humanitarian. The story of this remarkable woman began in 1909 when she was born in Glen Ellen, Illinois. As a child, she fantasized about becoming an explorer, and she was extraordinarily curious about the people she encountered. Her first exposure to dance occurred when she was in high school with a teacher who taught a kind of freestyle movement based on the concepts of Émile Jacques Delcroze and Rudolf Laban. In 1929, she moved to Chicago, where one of her first involvements in theater was, like Winfield, with a little theater group which became a kind of cultural center for young artists who were inspired by the zeitgeist of the Harlem Renaissance. The group even attracted luminaries such as Langston Hughes and Alan Locke when they passed through Chicago from time to time. But Dunham had a growing interest in studying dance, and unlike many aspiring Black dancers of the period, she had success in finding a teacher who would accept her as a student. Her first teacher, Mark Turbyfield, remembered her standing at the ballet bar, quote, "the only Black in a line of young women," unquote. Turbyfield's liberal nature enabled him to establish a bond with Dunham. They began to recruit more Black students, and they worked to interest the Black community in their projects. The result was a group they called Ballet Nègre, which first performed in 1931. Dunham collaborated with other European Americans as she explored dance performance opportunities. She joined with her Russian ballet teacher, Olga Speranzova, to establish a school and a company they called the Negro Dance Group. And she was also introduced to Ruth Page, ballet director of the Chicago Grand Opera, who gave Dunham the lead role in her West Indian ballet, La Gia Blaise. During all of these performance-related activities, Dunham also pursued her academic interest at the University of Chicago, where she eventually decided to major in anthropology as a way to sate her curiosity about the diverse roles dance could play in people's lives. Her studies at the university were deepened when she was mentored by Robert Redfield, one of the leading ethnologists of the time. As Dunham's visibility increased in the Chicago arts community, a fortuitous set of circumstances brought her work to the attention of the Rosenwald Foundation. The foundation had been established by an important figure in Harlem Renaissance philanthropy, Julius Rosenwald, who supported many African-American causes. As an indication of the connecting threads that formed a network of sociological, artistic, and financial dynamics during the period, we find that sociologist Charles S. Johnson had also received a Rosenwald grant. He continued to support the organization's goals, and he was an early supporter of the young Katherine Dunham's work. After presenting a written proposal and performing before the Rosenwald Committee members, Dunham received a grant to undertake anthropological research in Jamaica, Trinidad, Martinique, and Haiti. She set out on a journey that took more than a year, during which she studied African diaspora communities where dance was an important aspect of the religious, political, and social lives of the people. During her fieldwork, she also observed the centrality of African retentions in New World cultures. Of all the places she traveled, Haiti became the most important focus of her studies. The country and its people found a special place in her heart and in her aesthetic development as she became more familiar with the details of Haitian culture, the rich tapestry of African and Catholic elements in the Vodun religion, the elaborate pantheon of spirits, and most of all, the dances through which those spirits manifested themselves. After Dunham returned to Chicago, she established her school and her dance company and set off to engage in her life's work that would, over the coming decades, establish her as a uniquely significant influence in the world of dance. She and her company took part in several performance events in 1937, including the Negro Dance Evening at New York's YMYWHA, a program that she shared with several other Black artists. But her company's most significant appearance during the period occurred in 1940, when she presented a full-scale concert on Broadway at the Windsor Theater. Tropics and Le Jazz Hot was the occasion when many aspects of her career came together to create her distinctive form of dance theater. For that production, she had settled on a musical review format consisting of dramatic vignettes, dance, instrumental music, and vocal selections drawn from many cultures. A suite of dances, primitive rhythms, borrowed elements of Polynesian, Cuban, and Mexican culture. Peruvian, Bahiana, island songs, and tropics represented South America and the Caribbean islands, and the dances of urban and rural African-American culture were featured in Br'er Rabbit and the Tar Baby. Tropics and Le Jazz Hot was a full realization of Dunham's conceptualization of a type of theatrical performance that was based on her studies of dance as one of the most salient expressions of a people's culture. During her fieldwork, she had seen the myriad ways in which dance functioned in religious rituals, social gatherings such as Mardi Gras, and in work-related activities, as when laborers moved from one field to another to tend crops. One of her biographers, Joyce Aschenbrenner, discusses how Dunham's work in anthropology formed the foundation for all of the activities she engaged in, including her scholarly publications and lectures, her teaching, and her dance and theatrical performance. The author reminds us, for example, that when Dunham researched the Vodun religion in Haiti, she found the dances had several different functions that were reflected in different forms of movement. as Aschenbrenner states, quote, "Function is indicated by the emphasis on various parts of the body and the type of movement. For example, in the Petro dance in Haiti, which accompanies a destructive antisocial cult, the body movement involves opposition, projecting a hostile, frenzied feeling, preparing the participants for aggressive action. On the other hand, the Yonvolu, often representing the benevolent Radha Dahomey god Dambala, displays a fluidity, a soothing motion, and undulating movement signaling acceptance, prayer, and ecstasy. The Zepol, also a Radha Dahomey dance, exhibiting a contraction and expansion of the shoulders in a jerking movement, induces a kind of self-hypnotism, and the accompanying breathing generates excitement. The Congo Paete, in which a movement of the haunches is involved, is sexually stimulating, as are the dances with hip and stomach rotation. For all of these dances, release, the externalization of energy and emotions, serves a critical function." Unquote. When audiences and critics saw Dunham's transposition of these types of dance movements in Tropics and Le Jazz Hot, their responses ranged from ecstatic outbursts to desultory grumblings. Dance critic Walter Terry described the performance as the occasion that saw the Negro dance come into its own at last. Katherine Dunham proved herself the first pioneer of the Negro dance. John Martin concurred, saying that the work was, quote, "a revelation, the basis of a true Negro dance art," unquote. However, both critics felt the need to comment on what they considered to be Dunham's wise decision in her art making to stay away from the alien techniques, that is to say, Western high art forms. And John Martin went even further, reprimanding one of Dunham's male dancers, Tally Beatty, for his distressing tendency to introduce the technique of academic ballet into his performances. Over the coming years, critics would continue to swing back and forth between praise and damnation in their assessment of Dunham's work. And in one instance, in Boston in 1941, the city censor who decided what was or was not appropriate in theatrical productions banned part of Dunham's concert. That came about during the company's run of Tropical Review, which contained a fully conceived work titled Rite de Passage. In the section depicting a fertility ritual, the choreography for male and female dancers included hip isolations and pelvic thrusts that represented the centrality of procreation in a society's belief system. Moreover, Dunham was well aware that in the traditions of many African and Caribbean cultures, movement that appeared to be sexual in nature from a European American point of view could have more profound meanings to others. It could express a worldview in which sexual activity, procreation, and the life force that runs throughout the natural world are all joined in a spiritual continuum. In the fertility section, Dunham was attempting to show that a wide spectrum of bodily movements could have profound metaphysical meaning. But her intention of bringing such a concept into the theater was often misconstrued, as when one critic called Rite de Passage frankly erotic, offensive, and inexcusable. After the city censor attended a performance, that section of the concert was cut from the remainder of the company's run. By the time the Harlem Renaissance began to wane in the late 1930s, artists like Hemsley Winfield and Edna Guy had begun to lay the foundation for a vital form of dance art that others could build upon. Dunham had joined in that work, and her company would go on to tour nationally and internationally into the 1960s. Katherine Dunham's many accomplishments are incalculable. They include her development of a rigorous dance technique, her school in New York that she opened in 1944, and her establishment of an impactful inner-city arts program in East St. Louis, Illinois, during her later years in the 1960s. There's no room here to detail the full breadth and depth of her achievements. So I will conclude here by saying that in the face of entrenched racial barriers, artists like Dunham, Winfield, and Guy persisted against all odds to achieve parity in the world of the arts and to assure that the beauty of their unique form of dance did not go unrecognized. Thank you.
Hello, I am Matthew Henley. I am the Arnhold Associate Professor of Dance Education here at Teachers College, Columbia University, and I'd like to bring Dr. Perpener back to the screen with me.
Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us and for your very informative talk on dance history in the larger context of the Harlem Renaissance. It's really just an honor to have you here with us for our first symposium, and an honor to have you join us for a brief Q&A with a few of the students from the doctoral program. So we'll get started right away with our first student, which is Susan Pope.
Hello, Dr. Perpener. It is so good to see you again. So my question is, many of my family members migrated from the South to Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance, and I've heard stories of their experiences at the Savoy Ballroom, Small's Paradise, and the Cotton Club. How would you suggest I preserve these stories and pictures so they become archival artifacts?
Hi, Susan. I think the most accessible platforms for archiving your family's connections with Harlem clubs and dance halls would simply be through websites on the internet. For example, when I Googled African American chorus girls, Harlem Renaissance, I came up with sites that had dozens of photographs of Black performers of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Some of the sites were connected with libraries and universities, and some were private collections. So it seems to me that it would be a matter of you connecting with different groups and institutions and perhaps developing a website of your own. Now, I want to ask you about some of the narrative research you're conducting for your dissertation. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, so thank you so much for that information. So I had the opportunity to speak with some elders in my community this past summer in the Newark community where I teach as a part of a program called the Pearls of Wisdom in collaboration with the New Jersey Performing Arts Center. And their stories contributed greatly to the landscape of education in Newark, but they're hidden stories. So in the spirit of Sankofa, which is informing our future by looking at the past, and through the African view of Ubuntu, I am because we are, I decided to focus on the marginalization of embodied pedagogy in New Jersey urban teacher preparation programs. I will engage in narrative inquiry as a way to describe personal stories of embodied educators.
That's very interesting. And one of the things that you mentioned there was working with the New Jersey Performing Arts Center.
Yes.
So, for example, when you were asking me about where you could archive some of your research material, perhaps you could connect with them and present some ideas about them being involved in the preservation of these people's stories.
Great suggestion. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. The next student with a question is Ann Biddle.
Hello, Dr. Perpener. My questions are related to Winfield's life and work, and I would love to have you speak about the following. Who were Winfield's proteges? How was his work preserved or carried on? Did he notate his dances? And what other personal information have you discovered about Winfield? Did he have a family?
Interesting. I found that Winfield, since he worked in theater and dance, he was associated with some of the leading Black actors of the time, such as Inez Clow, who had toured Europe and America with musicals, performed in vaudeville, and performed on Broadway. Another international performer who was very interesting was Olga Burgoyne, who danced with his company. And so did Richard Bruce Nugent, who, if you look him up, you'll find that he was one of the most colorful characters of the Harlem Renaissance. Randolph Sawyer was another of his company members who had a long and distinguished career as a dancer. And in my book, there's a chapter where I combine, a single chapter where I combine discussions of Edna Guy, Olga Burgoyne, and Randolph Sawyer. He also worked with, these were not proteges, but people he was associated with. He worked with Hall Johnson, one of the best known choral directors of his time. It's mentioned that he studied with the Russian dancer Michael Mordkin, and there's some indication or the possibility that he also studied with Helen Tamiris, since she's known to have taught dance classes in Harlem. But with the exception of a few performances of the Emperor Jones after his death, his company really didn't continue to perform. Now, as far as biographical information goes, I didn't find much about his early life, just bits and pieces like the fact that his father was a civil engineer who had a contracting firm in Brooklyn. Interestingly, his mother was a playwright, and he produced and performed in several of her plays, such as The Promised Land at Carnegie Hall. He didn't notate his works, but there are typescripts that contain his written descriptions of several of his works at the Schomburg Center.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing this fascinating personal and professional information about this extraordinary man. So I have an additional question I'd love to pose to you about another theme in your lecture. Can you elaborate on your comments about Du Bois' talented 10th movement and sociological positivism as being both aspirational and intended to lead African Americans to a place of equal status in American society, as well as, quote, mired in self-abnegating essentialism? Can you speak more about the duality of this position, especially in regards to Du Bois' overarching commitment to racial uplift?
Certainly. The sociological positivism that Du Bois and Charles Johnson promoted was aspirational in the sense that it was a way of proving to the world that Black people deserved equality. Now, that today would be not such a popular approach to how we want to see ourselves. Basing that aspiration on the idea that Black people were especially gifted as artists always struck me as an interesting and questionable or problematic proposition. I found it interesting because it seems to have been conceived as a tactical maneuver to find the path of least resistance where African Americans could make substantial progress in mainstream society. I find it questionable because in its most derisive form, this approach might be equated with slaves performing in front of the big house so that they could ingratiate themselves with their masters. Scholars have long since discarded the idea of categorizing entire groups of people as having essential characteristics, though it might have been seen as a means of racial uplift during the 1920s. This way of thinking can also be viewed as opening the door for negative stereotypes. For example, one of the stereotypes that critics used during the period was the idea that African Americans were natural performers whose work sprang from atavistic impulses that resulted in the kind of effortless, unconscious performance that might be expected of all Black people. From this perspective, the work of Black artists, unlike that of white artists, didn't need to be viewed as reflecting dedicated attention to technical training, and artistic refinement. By framing artists' work as unadulterated racial expression, critics could, in effect, exclude them from the serious genres of contemporary concert art. So there I've just addressed kind of the pros and cons of that idea.
Well, thank you so much for this rare opportunity to ask you about your research. It was a great honor to have a chance to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne. Our third student with a question is Dawn Marie Bazemore.
Greetings, Dr. Perpener. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about Black dance. So my question is, defining Black dance seems to be an ongoing conversation amongst Black dancers, specifically those who have danced in or worked with entities that identify as Black dance companies. Would you define Black dance as Black bodies dancing, or perhaps an art form lending itself more to the ideals of both Du Bois and Winfield, utilizing high art to propel the experiences of African Americans forward in an effort to establish equal standing with their white counterparts?
Hi, Don. I'll begin by saying that if we define Black dance as being Black bodies dancing, then we have to deal with the essentialist ramifications of identifying artists by the color of their skin. I can think of that as a kind of racial/artistic profiling. In a recent essay I wrote, I asked, what if a light-skinned dancer who appears to be white identifies themselves as being Black? Is that still a Black dancer doing Black dance? And these kinds of what-if questions are ones that always seem to come up when we begin trying to define Black dance. For example, is Black dance the Dance Theater of Harlem performing Swan Lake? Questions like that, they come up again and again. The kind of racial questioning that I mentioned before, I find it almost cringeworthy in that it's based solely on the superficial appraisal of skin color. But I do think that it is an acceptable part of a discourse that centers on constructed categories of race that are questionable. In a related vein, dance critic and historian Zeta Allen, in a 2001 essay, pointed out that white critics and Arts Council members often use the term Black dance as a way of lumping diverse artists into categories where they are often dealt with summarily. They, quote, make generalizations about the work of an entire segment of America's dance community, unquote. In other words, they create a template concerning how Black dance should be dealt with. As far as the second part of your question, I think there have always been African American dancers who use their work for socio-political purposes, including racial uplift, protest, and resistance. This, to me, might come closer to a definition of Black dance that I would support. And of course, you can see how equivocal I'm being, because I do see this as an ongoing discussion, and I'm not attempting to come up with a specific concrete definition. In a recent panel, I used quotes from two pioneering African-American artists, Catherine Dunham and Pearl Primus, that indicated their intent of taking an activist stance through their art. After Primus performed at Madison Square Garden in 1945, she said, quote, I know we must all do our part in this war to beat fascism, and I consider the battle against Jim Crow in America part of the fight which is taking place on the battlefronts of the world. Each one of us can field a weapon against Jim Crow and fascism, and my special weapon is dancing. I shall continue to protest Jim Crow through my dancing until victory is won, unquote. She had just performed Hard Time Blues, her protest against the plight of Black sharecroppers in the South. In a similar vein, Catherine Dunham said in a 1977 interview, quote, "I think that what we went through during the 30s and thought we had conquered in the 40s gave me enough stamina and many times enough energy, enough strategy to live through the 50s and the 60s. I think that's the only thing I could have done. I was inculcated with the idea of eliminating social injustice," unquote. So what I think I'm saying is that I would be comfortable with a broad definition of Black dance that included many things: the artist's intent, her aesthetic choices, her movement vocabulary. Those are things we haven't even discussed, that I haven't even discussed yet. Perhaps it's the artist herself who decides whether or not what she does might be considered Black dance, and not some outside arbiter. That would make it a very fluid definition. So as you see, I've skirted all around the issue. And I find that when this debate comes up, that's always what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Many perspectives and points of view are discussed, but I've seldom found that a concrete definition is settled upon.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Dawn Marie. Yes, as you say, these are ongoing discussions, and it's so important to continue to have discussions, to continue to engage in discussions. And I think one of the wonderful things about your work is it reveals the importance of history to ongoing discussions, and keeping that part of the conversation. So I want to thank Susan and Anne and Dawn Marie for joining us this evening. If you're interested in reading more of Dr. Perpener's work, you can go to the Arnhold Symposium website bookstore and find his work there. Dr. Perpener, I want to echo the students in saying what an honor it is to have you here with us for the first Arnhold Symposium. Your work has contributed so greatly to the development and growth and awakening and education of so many dancers and dance educators, and it really is truly an honor to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's great to have been here.